Anarchy is a term that has followed in the footsteps as many other political terms, that is, being ambiguous in definition. Much like words such as capitalism and socialism, both amateurs and expert political observers can never agree on what anarchy is as a political ideology. Anarchy as a word, however, is commonly used in mainstream culture to describe something as chaotic or lawless. When most people hear anarchy, they usually think of this meaning, but in reality, it is much more complicated. The term anarchy is derived from the Greek word anarchos, meaning without a ruler. Anarchism rejects the concept of a centralized state, as well as the institution of capitalism. Anarchists believe hierarchies to be both unnatural and unjust institutions that prevent humans from living free lives. Anarchy comes in many forms, with some forms retaining money as a means of economic exchange, while others want to abolish money altogether. Some forms of anarchy still retain organized government in a decentralized way by giving power to local communities, while others have no organization in society at all. To see the wide variety of forms anarchy can take, we must first examine anarchist theory and its theorists. Mutualism is the first major anarchist ideology which gained notoriety as a genuine political ideology. It was created by French anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in the early 1800s. Proudhon was born into a poor peasant family in 1809, where he was regarded as an intelligent child. His intelligence would lead him to being awarded a scholarship to attend the university in Besançon, France. Proudhon would continue to struggle financially, even with his scholarship, and was forced to take a job as a printer while going to college. This job as a printer would change his life, as it introduced him to many different political organizations who sought to print documents related to their political agendas. It is here where Proudhon was introduced to the socialist movement, with many people, including the famous utopian socialist Charles Fourier, frequenting his shop. Soon Proudhon would be given the opportunity to study in Paris, where he would begin writing his major works. Here, Proudhon would write the book, What is Property?, in which he famously declared property to be theft. Proudhon was not opposed to personal property. He mainly attacked the idea of privately owned property, which would include any property that would then exploit a person's labor. Proudhon, however, believed that the means of production were a piece of property which were necessary for individual liberty, and that workers had the right to own their own workplace, farmers the right to own their own farmland, etc. This book would also mark the first time in which Proudhon would refer to himself as an anarchist. In 1843, Proudhon moved to Lyon, where he got a job as a managing clerk of a distribution company. Here he encountered a group of people known as the Mutualists. The Mutualists were a secret guild of weavers which advocated for the Jacobin ideas of the French Revolution. The Mutualists believed that factories, which were just starting to become the major form of economic production in France at the time, could be run mutually by a group of workers without any form of authoritarian structure, such as a factory owner or boss. Proudhon was heavily sympathetic to these people and would adopt their name to describe his own philosophy of anarcho-mutualism. Proudhon would adopt the idea of workers' councils as a major tenet of his philosophy and advocated for their creation in factories. Proudhon would soon become a widely known figure within the socialist movement. It even reached the attention of Karl Marx, who would heavily criticize Proudhon's work, and the two would fight a bitter rivalry with each other for the rest of their lives. Marx argued that Proudhon's claim that property is theft was a contradiction of his principles and an endorsement of the bourgeoisie. Marx argued that the term theft is used by the bourgeois to describe when their property has been taken, and therefore presupposes the notion that property is a just institution. Marx, believing Proudhon to be nothing more than a buffoon, secretly advocating for the bourgeoisie, traveled to Paris in 1844 to personally debate Proudhon on philosophical concepts. Marx and Proudhon would often spend entire nights debating socialism and anarchy, with Marx often challenging Proudhon with Hegelian philosophy, which Marx described as infecting him very much to his detriment with Hegelianism. Marx and Proudhon would not personally meet again, but Marx would still often write about his interactions with Proudhon, sometimes with praise, but mostly with criticism. In 1848, Proudhon participated in the French Revolution of 1848, further solidifying his notoriety within the leftist movement. At this time, he decided to create his own newspaper, which he had previously tried during his time in Besançon, but failed. During this new creation of a newspaper, which he had named Le Représentant du Peuple, he was simultaneously elected to serve on the National Assembly of the newly founded French Second Republic. As a constituent, he heavily criticized Napoleon III for being an authoritarian. In addition to being a member of the new National Assembly, he also attempted to create a new form of national bank for the Republic, which he called a People's Bank. The idea behind it was that a system of mutual credit would be paid to workers given how many hours they spent producing a good. This idea never came to fruition, partially because he would shortly be imprisoned after his election due to Napoleon III coming back to power and Proudhon being accused of criticizing the government. In his jail cell, he continued his work on his newspaper and even got married. When Proudhon was released from prison in 1852, he found himself struggling to make ends meet. Given his notoriety as a former criminal, the French police often harassed him. In addition to this, he found it impossible to write anymore because no publisher would publish or distribute his books. Proudhon would move to Belgium to avoid further imprisonment, as the one book he was able to publish was banned by the government, and Proudhon was on the run from the French authorities. By the time of his death in 1865, workers of Paris began to adopt his ideas for the communist movement, with many leaders of the First International considering themselves to be Proudhonian mutualists. Most anarchist ideologies have one thing in common, that is, a heavy focus on community and mutualism. However, with our next ideology, it will become obvious that this is not always the case with anarchist ideologies. Egoism is a form of anarchism with a heavy emphasis on the individual, or as the founder Max Stirner described, the ego. According to Stirner, we as humans are all selfish creatures, and every action we do in life is based around our selfish desire to satisfy our egos. And therefore, every one of us is in some form an egoist. Stirner put egoists into two categories, voluntary and involuntary. An involuntary egoist is someone who does not consciously know that they are an egoist and does things that are seen by society as charitable or good. This may include following the law, telling the truth, or giving money to charity. Stirner said that the reason why people do this is because they feel as if they are fulfilling some higher purpose and that they will benefit from doing these things, when in reality they are being selfish. A voluntary egoist, on the other hand, is a person who is fully aware that they are an egoist with selfish desires, and therefore every action they take, they do because it will satisfy their ego. Stirner had a heavy emphasis on humans needing to reject the state as well as religion. This was because Stirner believed that these ideas of religion and government to be non-existent and created to enforce unjust authority. As mentioned before, the founder of this ideology was a man named Max Stirner, a German who attended Hegel's lectures at the University of Berlin. Stirner was fascinated by Hegelian philosophy and decided to form a club of sorts with people who shared Stirner's love of this philosophy. This club was known as the Young Hegelians and consisted of famous German philosophers such as Ludwig Feuerbach and Friedrich Engels. Meetings consisted of going to a local bar in Berlin and discussing philosophical concepts of the time. Sometimes meetings would get out of hand, with Max Stirner getting into a fistfight with Bruno Bauer, another member of the club. Stirner was able to get a job at a prestigious girls' school at this time, which although he didn't necessarily enjoy, it paid the bills. However, at night, he worked on what would become his most famous work, The Ego and Its Own. In 1844, he published the book, and it became relatively popular until it was banned by the Prussian government and many other countries in the region. This was around the time when Stirner would leave the Young Hegelians due to many of its members being heavily scrutinized in his book. A few years after The Ego and Its Own was published, Stirner was hard on his luck. After the publication of his book, he was fired from his job at the school which he taught at and struggled to make ends meet. This led Stirner to create a business based on egoist principles. He met with a cousin of Bruno Bauer, the man which he had previously punched in the face, and decided to create a co-op milk business. In order to do this, Stirner had contacted local dairy farmers around Berlin to join his operation and supply his milk. Sterner would then store a large amount of milk in a warehouse where he could then sell it in bulk. Sterner's plan would eventually fail as the warehouse was not properly ventilated and led to the milk going bad. In addition to that, Sterner had not paid the rent and was evicted from the property shortly afterward. Even worse is that the money he had invested in the business was his wife's inheritance. When Sterner told her about what happened, she left him and moved to Australia. Sterner would spend the rest of his life in and out of debtor's prison, where he eventually died of an infected bug bite. Sterner became long forgotten and was not widely known until a brief resurgence of interest in egoism, which occurred in the early 1900s. It was led by Scottish anarchist John Henry Mackay, who wrote Sterner's biography. Sterner's philosophy has failed to gain major recognition in both anarchist and broad political circles, mostly due to the fact that egoism is more of a philosophical view of life as compared to a political system. Unlike previously mentioned anarchist ideologies, egoism does not have a concrete basis for economic, labor, or administrative systems, instead replacing it with Sterner's concept of the union of egoists, an idea which society is comprised not of the state, but rather a society that is comprised of individual egoists. For egoists, government is an institution that is merely an illusion and not an actual force. Anarcho-communism is a kind of anarchy that aims to achieve communism through anarchist means. This ideology defines its perfect society as one free of unjust hierarchies, capitalism, and a centralized state. When hearing this description, one might think of anarcho-mutualism, the ideology created by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. However, there are several distinct differences that separate these two ideologies. The first is that mutualism still allows for there to be money, in the form of credits, as outlined by Proudhon's idea of a people's bank, but in anarcho-communism, money is completely abolished. The second is that anarcho-mutualism is a market socialist-based ideology, as goods are distributed based around workers collectively owning the means of production, whereas in anarcho-communism, goods are distributed based around the idea of mutual aid. Mutual aid is a form of distribution created by Peter Kropotkin, the man that first coined the phrase anarcho-communism, which is a form of distribution of goods without any money involved, and in which is based around mutual benefit. Such instances of anarcho-communism can be found as early as the English Civil War. This organization, known as the Diggers, was not only the first organized anarchist society, but also the first socialist society. Unlike many future anarchist societies, the Diggers were all religious Protestants, and their main motivations for the creation of their society was due to the ongoing English Civil War. The majority of participants in the English Civil War were involved due to religious and political reasons, but the Diggers were looking for revolutionary and radical redistribution of land from the wealthy landowners to the poor. This agrarian socialist society was started during the later years of the war, with the start of the movement being around 1649. Some viewers will point out that so far I've called this society both an agrarian socialist and also anarchist society, which is due to the fact that they were both. The Diggers were very decentralized and had no organized hierarchy or leader. They did, however, have some major figureheads, such as Gerard Winstanley, the founder of the movement, but the organization remained mostly decentralized. Rather than a centralized government, the Diggers organized themselves into communes in which multiple people worked on the land as a collective. These communes, however, were limited to the areas of southern England and the areas around London. The start of the communes was due to the bad harvest which had occurred in the previous years leading up to 1649. The poor harvest that had occurred in England led to both a food shortage and an unemployment crisis, as many farmers could no longer support themselves. In addition to this, many industries that had previously prospered were on the brink of collapse. This was the case with Gerald Winstanley, a cloth merchant who had become bankrupt with the onset of the Civil War. Though after his cloth business failed, Winstanley would turn to becoming a farmer, which would have been a good idea, except for the fact that a catastrophically bad series of harvests was about to occur. Enraged, Winstanley did what any person in hard times would do during the time of political and social upheaval: read radical pamphlets. Winstanley wrote pamphlets in which he argued for socialist reforms and a redistribution of land among the poor. What is unique about his writings as compared to future anarchist theorists is that he used religion to his advantage, in which he argued that the ownership of private property went against Christianity and private property ought to be abolished. With the arrival of the bad harvest, Winstanley would soon band together with other impoverished farmers to go and seize land. The settlement which he founded would be on St. George's Hill on the outskirts of London. Over 200 years later, a Russian named Peter Kropotkin would create an ideology known as anarcho-communism. Kropotkin was originally destined to become a member of the Russian military, like his father, who was a major general. Instead, however, Kropotkin pursued a more academic life while still being in the army. Around this time, Peter Kropotkin's first exposure to revolutionary ideas was when his cousin was able to get his hand on one of Alexander Herzen's periodicals called The Polar Star, which urged revolutionary reforms in Russia. This greatly inspired Kropotkin and marked his shift to the left. In 1860, Kropotkin would start publishing his first newspaper advocating for a Russian constitution. He would become a geographer in 1862 and would travel to Siberia, where apart from his duties as an army officer, he would do geographical surveys of the region as a part of research done for the Corps of Pages Military Academy in St. Petersburg. During this time, Kropotkin would see the lives of peasants and political exiles forced to work in the cold tundras of Siberia. This time period led to Kropotkin's further discontent with the government. Kropotkin left the military in 1867 and went to St. Petersburg to enroll in university. During this time, he would go on several geographical expeditions in Finland and Sweden to study glaciers. In 1871, he was asked to become the secretary of the Russian Geographical Society, but refused due to him deciding to dedicate his life to a life of social activism. After his return to St. Petersburg, Kropotkin joined a secret society known as the Tchaikovsky Circle, which distributed left-wing propaganda aimed at workers and peasants in Russia. With increasingly harsher laws on political dissidents due to the attempted assassination of Alexander II, Kropotkin moved to Western Europe, where he joined the International Workingmen's Association. This organization led Kropotkin to openly refer to himself as a socialist, but became disillusioned with the bureaucratic nature of the establishment organization. He then decided to join the anarchist faction of the International, which was referred to as the Bakunis, named after Pierre Joseph Proudhon's unofficial successor, Mikhail Bakunin, who rejected the concept of the state as a way of achieving a communist society. Kropotkin would travel to Switzerland to visit the Jura Foundation, an organization of anarchist watchmakers which were affiliated with the Bakunis. The watchmakers had a business model of mutual ownership of the production of watches. This heavily influenced Kropotkin and would provide the foundation of his theory of mutual aid. Kropotkin then returned to Russia, but was quickly arrested due to his revolutionary activities of attempting to smuggle banned pro-communist books into the country. He escaped prison and fled to Switzerland, but was arrested again by French police and jailed for sedition. 3 years later, in 1886, he would settle in London, where he would live to write his most famous works. The first being The Conquest of Bread, which he wrote in 1892. He made the argument that all property ought to be commonly owned. He argued that whenever a new invention is created, it is done so using inventions people have already created. For instance, he gives the example of the steam engine. The steam engine is a collective work to create. The screws were invented by someone, the steel was invented by someone, and the process to put it all together was invented by someone. In other words, everything ought to be commonly owned as everyone contributes to some degree in creating goods and services. Kropotkin believed capitalism not only to be a system that unfairly steals wealth from people, but also ideas, as people use other people's ideas to generate profit to create new products, which they claim to be their own singular idea. Kropotkin would stay in London until 1917, in which the Russian Revolution occurred. Kropotkin was originally supportive of the revolution, but his endorsement would soon drop when he found it had become too bureaucratic. He would then die of pneumonia in 1920. Anarcho-syndicalism is an anarchist ideology heavily influenced by anarcho-communism. What sets it apart from anarcho-communism, however, is the specific strategy it outlines to achieve anarchy. Anarcho-syndicalism specifically argues that the way to achieve anarchy is to do it via syndicalism. Syndicalism was a labor movement popular in the early 1900s, which argued that the means of production should be specifically given to labor unions as compared to simply the workers. Anarcho-syndicalists argued that an anarchist union of workers would come together and seize the means of production, and the factory or workplace would be managed based on a democratic union structure. With the factories now seized, workers would then be able to abolish the state due to them having control over the industry of the state. Anarcho-syndicalism was developed out of the French socialist movement based on the ideas of people such as Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Auguste Blanqui. By the early 1900s, many different syndicalist organizations were created, such as the Union Syndicale Italiana, Freie Arbeiter-Union Deutschlands, Federación Obrero Region Argentina, and the Confederación Nacional Trabajo. Most of these organizations struggled to survive due to the government opposition to many of these groups. Another problem which some of these groups faced was national syndicalism, a far-right ideology that used syndicalist tactics to overthrow the government, but instead of an anarchist society, they would create a fascist state. This problem of fifth columnists infiltrating labor unions, however, was only an issue in Italy, and trade unionists were able to stop any fascists from getting into their movement. However, the most prominent issue facing the anarcho-syndicalists was the large governmental opposition to their cause. Many anarcho-syndicalist trade unions participated in general strikes, which would just lead to more opposition from the government. The Argentine Regional Workers' Federation was one of many syndicalist trade unions that would meet their demise from government oppression, as during the tragic week of 1919, many members of the ARWF would march in Buenos Aires and were killed by police. This increased force against anarchism led to the ARWF's decline, as well as internal conflicts about how to continue on with the organization after many of the recent setbacks since the tragic week. Another organization that was forced to disband due to increased government opposition was the FRAUD, or the Free Workers of Germany. This anarcho-syndicalist trade union was heavily present in the German Revolution of 1919, a communist revolution led by revolutionaries Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. This organization was headed by a mostly decentralized leadership structure and was originally affiliated with the Social Democratic SPD of Germany and formed a union known as the FVDG. But due to its increasingly radical tendencies, it was expelled from being affiliated with the party. This expulsion from the SPD would lead to the union's decline and disbandment in the mid-1910s. The union was able to revive itself, however, with the creation of FAUD. This new organization was headed by members of the previous union, such as Rudolf Rocker and Fritz Kater. The union still struggled to compete with the SPD as the main left-wing political organization, but found new life during the German Revolution of 1919. As mentioned before, the German Revolution was primarily led by communist revolutionaries Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, but anarcho-syndicalists still fought alongside the mainstream communists. This revolution, however, was short-lived, with many of its leaders being executed by the German government, including anarchist writer Gustav Landauer during the Munich Uprising, in which pro-communists attempted to establish a Soviet republic in Bavaria. Landauer was extremely prominent to syndicalists at this time due to him being the German translator and editor for many of Peter Kropotkin's writings, and his death was a huge blow to the morale of the movement. The German Revolution ultimately failed and resulted in many prominent leaders of the anarcho-syndicalist movement being arrested and executed. However, many surviving members attempted to continue the organization, but continued to decline due to government opposition until it was banned by the Nazi Party in 1933. The last surviving leader was Fritz Kater, who died while attempting to defuse a bomb in World War II. He failed and died to the explosion, just like his children and grandchildren did just days before his death. France would also experience its fair share of anarcho-syndicalist trade unions, with many forming as breakoffs from the Communist Party of France. However, their strikes were mostly ineffective, and they were terrible at recruiting new members. Many of the people that they would have attracted, however, were already invested in other trade unions, such as the Communist Party and the French section of the Workers' International. The failure to attract any members would eventually lead to its decline, as many larger left-wing groups had already existed. The most successful of the anarcho-syndicalist trade unions, however, would be the CNT in Spain, or Confederación Nacional Trabajo. This organization was originally a small union, with as little as 500 members. However, by 1936 they had over 2 million members, and many of the cabinet positions in Spain were held by CNT members. However, by the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939, fascists took control of the government, and labor unions such as the CNT became banned. As I have discussed, anarchist ideologies do not advocate for a disorganized, unruly society, but rather one in which people are free of centralized power. However, one cannot discuss anarchy without discussing anarcho-primitivism. When first introduced to this idea, many might immediately recognize that the word primitivism is used to describe Neolithic societies. This ideology does indeed hold that these societies were the greatest form that society has ever taken, one in which modern technology, capitalism, and laws are abolished and replaced with one of our hunter-gatherer ancestors. The first prominent movement to endorse this ideology was a group of English workers known as the Luddites. The movement was named after a character in British working-class mythology known as Ned Ludd, a disgruntled worker in the late 18th century who destroyed textile machinery in a fit of rage. Many workers took this story as a rejection of technology and that they should follow in Ludd's footsteps and destroy technology. It should be noted that although many have considered all of the Luddites to be anti-technology, this wasn't necessarily the case for all of them. For some, it was merely an example of protest, that is, destroying machinery they were forced to operate for little pay. The Luddite movement was highly popular among the British working class starting at around 1811. This was mostly due to the Napoleonic Wars, causing a decline in the quality of life for members of the British working class. The economic inequality that ensued led to the popularity of the Luddites increasing. Large amounts of Luddites plagued the British countryside, destroying factories and machinery throughout the industrial regions of the United Kingdom. The Luddites would soon become a problem for the British, and Parliament quickly acted to bust the movement. Eventually, the movement would be suppressed in the mid-1810s. Anarcho-primitivism would enter the public consciousness yet again in the 1990s, when the Unabomber would randomly bomb places in the United States. However, the Unabomber made a deal with the Washington Post to publish his manifesto, and in exchange he would stop the bombings. When this occurred, the Washington Post published the Unabomber's manifesto, known as Industrial Society and Its Future, in which he outlined his ideology of anarcho-primitivism and how technology was actually a threat to human freedom, as well as generally being a bad thing. In addition to that, the Unabomber also argued that modern society should be completely abolished and be replaced with the society of our Neolithic ancestors. Now that we have examined the many different forms which anarchy can take, many will wonder whether or not these ideas have translated into actual governmental systems. Answer: they have. But how successful were these anarchist societies, and do they prove that anarchy is a valid political system? Let's find out. The first major society to be considered anarchist was that of the Paris Commune of 1871. The Paris Commune was the result of fears of a returning monarchy after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Parliament at this time had a royalist majority, or people that supported a monarchy. While democratically elected by France, the population of Paris had much different views from the national populace. In addition to this, the government that ran France at the time was elected by only a fraction of the population of France, as the election was held during wartime. This reaction by the citizens of Paris was similar to that of the Great Fear during the French Revolution, when people feared a monarchist plot to take power away from the Third Estate. But this time in 1871, there would be an actual attempt to take away power of the lower class. During this time period, Emperor Napoleon III had been captured by Prussian forces during the Battle of Sedan, where he became a prisoner of war. A provisional government was forced to form in replacement of the now captured Napoleon. In January of 1871, a large group of demonstrators marched in Paris demanding the overthrow of the government. This group was organized primarily by the Blanquistes, a group of revolutionary socialists who followed the teachings of Louis-Auguste Blanqui, a socialist that advocated for a vanguard party establishing a dictatorship of the proletariat, similarly to how Lenin would describe his ideology many years later. As mentioned before, this new government, called the Government of National Defense, would attempt to end the war against Prussia. Their provisional government signed a treaty with the Prussians, giving them the territory of Alsace-Lorraine. In the first 2 months of 1871, Prussian troops had surrounded Paris while the provisional government was set up in Bordeaux, far away from the front lines of the war. The capitulation of Paris led to many Parisians feeling abandoned by their government, and further resentment arose. One policy passed by the government was the disbandment of the National Guard in Paris, which deeply angered many Parisians, as most members were industrial workers, which continued their fears of a monarchist takeover. After attempting to seize the cannons from the Paris National Guard, violence broke out and a revolt against the provisional government ensued. At this time, the National Guard had decided to establish their own government, and so in Paris, elections were held with a victory for the revolutionaries. However, the revolutionaries would split into 3 major factions. The first faction was the Jacobins, or the quote-unquote orthodox revolutionaries. The majority of the socialists that were elected to the Paris Commune were Jacobins. The Jacobins were socialists in the traditional sense, meaning they followed the ideologies of the Jacobins of the French Revolution. They believed that the Paris National Assembly should be at the forefront of the revolution, and that they should be the people who dictate how to carry out the revolution. They were primarily focused on social change as compared to political change, although they advocated for a republican system of government. The Proudhonists were the second faction of the National Assembly, also called the Anarchists. The Proudhonists were members of the National Assembly who advocated the ideas of the anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. They believed that the revolution should continue by setting up individual communes in other French cities, similar to the one that was set up in Paris. The last faction of revolutionaries were the Blanquistes. The Blanquistes were a faction of the revolutionaries who advocated the ideas of Louis-Auguste Blanqui. They advocated for revolutionary violence against the provisional government and wanted to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. After elections were held, the Paris government, briefly run by the National Guard, dissolved and was then replaced by the newly elected Parliament of the Paris Commune. The National Assembly then abolished the army, but then went on to arm the citizens in order to continue having a defense force. The Commune would declare the Commune to be a secular state and ended funding for religious institutions as well as seizing private property held by the church. The French government would, on April 7th, begin executing captured communards, and shortly afterward the French army would begin an offensive from southern Paris, but were forced to retreat after the communards pushed them back. The Commune would continue passing reforms in Paris while the city was being attacked, such as the abolition of interest on debt, better working hours for laborers, and even collectivization of factories, while opening up ones that had previously closed and employing them with people who had already worked there. The Commune also abolished pawn shops, deeming them to be counter-revolutionary and an exploitive institution. However, on May 21st, French troops from Versailles would invade Paris, finding weak points in the defenses of Paris and overrunning the city in about a week. The remaining communards not killed in the siege were either executed or exiled from France. The Paris Commune would inspire many socialists around the world, and would be met with praise by communist thinkers such as Marx and Kropotkin, but despite the revolution being based mostly on the writings of Proudhon, he had unfortunately died 6 years earlier. With the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, nearly every left-wing political movement or organization was initially supportive of the Bolshevik government, with many reversing this once Lenin released his state capitalist economic plan, the NEP. One of the groups that would emerge out of the newly established Soviet Union was the Black Army led by Nestor Makhno. Nestor Makhno was born in 1888 in the town of Guliapol in Ukraine, which at the time was a part of the Russian Empire. During this time period, Ukraine was based around an agrarian economy, even more so than the already agrarian Russia. It was here in the agrarian Ukraine where Makhno would endure a hard childhood living as a poor peasant. Although his father had been emancipated under the emancipation of the serfs, he was still forced to continue working for his former master. By the time of the early 1900s, Makhno's hometown had become more, but not fully industrialized, with many workers who were once peasants working in small factories or mills. Makhno had begun taking jobs as an apprentice at a local dye factory, and would also get a job as a metal worker. It was at this time when Makhno began his resentment of the rich. Makhno would originally be supportive of the Menshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, but would eventually join an anarcho-communist group which his brothers were a part of. With the outbreak of the Russian Revolution of 1905, many Soviets or workers' councils would be established in major Ukrainian cities such as Kharkiv and Kiev. However, the Revolution of 1905 would mark serious losses for the anarcho-communists. With the political dissent that occurred during the revolution, the Russian government became increasingly aggressive towards getting rid of these groups. It was at this point when the previously peaceful anarchists resorted to violent tactics against the state. Such was the case with the anarchists of Guliapol, with many of them carrying out bombings and robberies of banks. During this time, the organization which Makhno belonged to, the Peasants' Group of Anarcho-Communists, began to arrange meetings to coordinate their ideology in the new Russia which was actively pursuing them. Makhno was a frequent attendant of these meetings and often hosted his home as a meeting place. Makhno even was one of the people who crafted bombs for the organization, which he did by using his mother's stove and cookware, and nearly led to him blowing up his own house. The anarchist group would go on to continue raiding wealthy merchants, banks, and even a wine shop. Some of these robberies they would be able to do without their cover being blown, but many led to violence. The increasing amount of crimes which occurred during this time led to the police focusing their resources on tracking down the anarchists. Police were able to apprehend many of the members of this group, including Makhno. In 1910, Makhno was sentenced to death by hanging, but his sentence was later reduced due to his young age. In prison, he would meet Peter Arshinov, a fellow anarchist who would solidify his loyalty to the anarchist movement. It wasn't until 1917, during the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, Makhno would be released from prison. When Makhno returned to his hometown, he found the anarchist organization he once knew in disarray. The anarchist movement had dwindled largely due to the members of the organization that had once thrived being either exiled or executed. When he returned from exile, he would organize a local peasant union in his village of Guliapol. It was here when the Ukrainian Free Territory would begin. Makhno would continue creating peasant unions in neighboring villages. These peasant unions were similar to that of the Russian Soviets, but based on an agrarian economy instead of an industrial one. Due to the power struggles occurring in Russia at the time, Makhno was largely unnoticed by the government, and his anarcho-communist movement was easily able to take power. During this time, the committee collectivized all production and agriculture, was run in a mutual aid style fashion. He would go back to his roots as a youth, robbing trains and wealthy landowners to redistribute wealth into the hands of workers and peasants. Another main difference between the Soviet and Ukrainian communes was the structure. In Ukraine, Local bodies of farmers controlled the land, compared to the top-down organization of the Soviet ones. Although agrarian, Makhno suggested many peasants to build factories in order to eventually transition to an industrialized economy. However, at the same time, the Eastern Front of World War I was turning in the favor of the Germans, and one of the many areas which the Germans was attacking was Ukraine. Makhno knew he needed to fend off the invaders, and so he created the Black Army, the army of the newly founded Ukrainian Free Territory, to protect the collectivized farms and factories. The Black Army played no role in the lives of those who lived in the Free Territory, as it was created merely as a way to preserve the anarchist ideology. They even created their own flag, a black flag with a skull and crossbones with the statement, "Death to all those who stand in the way of working people." The Free Territory invaded areas under both Bolshevik and White Army control, where they fervently practiced freedom of speech and allowed areas to create their own independent newspapers. The Black Army was also small compared to the other sides in the Russian Civil War, which led to the practice of guerrilla warfare. They would continue fighting against the Germans until the peace treaty between the Russians and Germans was signed, ending the war on the Eastern Front. This led to the next enemy for the Free Territory, the White Army. Although they had previously fought the White Army, their main attention was the Central Powers. With the exit of Russia from the war, the Black Army could turn its attention to defeating the White Army. The Bolsheviks also turned their attention to defeating the White Army, leading to an alliance between the Bolsheviks and the Black Army. Makhno had previously met with Lenin in 1917, where they were mostly friendly with each other, but now there was caution between the two, as there was now fighting between the two ideologies. The representatives of the groups met in 1919 and agreed to an alliance to defeat the forces of Anton Denikin, who at the time was headed towards Moscow. The Soviets supplied the anarchists with weapons, and eventually the two armies were able to defeat the White Army. However, the Soviets would eventually become hostile with the anarchists, once they no longer were of any use to them. The Soviets invaded the Free Tory led by Leon Trotsky, and the anarchist experiment ended. The Free Territory was the first of its kind. It was the first territory to be stateless and had no ruler. Many will point out that Makhno acted as a leader, but in reality he had little power in the territory and acted more as a military advisor to the army and an economic advisor to the peasants and local unions. Makhno would be exiled to France following the Russian Civil War and would die of tuberculosis in 1934. With anarchy having its roots in Europe, many may assume that anarchy would only be prevalent in Europe. However, this was certainly not the case, as one of the most prominent anarchist movements actually took place in Korea and Manchuria. This anarchist society would exist from 1929 to 1931, and although primarily in Manchuria, it was populated predominantly by Koreans, as it served as a safe haven away from Japanese imperialism. The reason for this movement being able to accumulate such a large following was due to the Japanese expansionism occurring during this time. It started in 1894 when Japan invaded Korea, which it justified by claiming it was protecting it from Chinese imperialism. This would eventually lead to the protests of 1919, in which many Korean students would protest against imperial rule by the Japanese Empire. Among the people who participated in this event were a large number of people belonging to anarchist organizations. Among the 2 million participants in these protests, very few of them were actually anarchists, and yet much of the Japanese bourgeois blamed the riots on the anarchists. In fact, anarchists became the main scapegoat for every problem, including the Japanese earthquake in 1923 occurring in Tokyo, which led to violent mobs of Japanese nationalists beating up Korean workers living in Japan. Korean anarchists were also arrested and put to death or jailed with extensive sentences. In 1924, the Korean Anarchist Federation was established. They created a manifesto in which they described the Japanese Empire stealing Korea from them and how they would attempt to liberate Korea by revolutionary means. The organization quickly began recruiting members all over Asia, including places as far away as Vietnam and Taiwan. The tactics used by this organization was mainly printing out leaflets and organizing trade unions to resist the Japanese occupation. However, other anarchists sought to establish more advanced forms of resistance. One example of this are the anarchist communes created in Manchuria by Korean anarchist Kim Jong-jin. Originally, the purpose of these communes was to train militia groups to create a guerrilla army capable of liberating Korea from the Japanese. But in addition to training soldiers, Kim Jong-jin organized agrarian communes for collectivized farming under the principles of anarcho-communism and mutual aid. In addition to that, free education was created for everybody under 18 in order to combat rural illiteracy rates. In these communes, people that lived there were organized into self-governing local governments and villages. On top of this was an executive branch made up of delegates from villages to run cabinet positions such as in education, transportation, and health administration. However, fears about this organization started to take hold in the Soviet Union about the society, which led to Stalin sending in assassins to murder the founders. Kim Jong-jin was killed by Stalinists, and when he was reported dead, the organization immediately put all their resources into keeping the communes stable. The Stalinists were attacking them from the north, while the Japanese army attacked them from the south. By 1931, so many anarchists had been killed that the remaining members fled and went into hiding. The CNT was an anarcho-syndicalist trade union which operated in Spain starting in 1910. During its early years, it only had a few thousand members, but by the end of 1936, it had nearly 2 million members. During early 1936, Spain was divided between the political left and right, and many feared a civil war would break out. In February of 1936, an election was held pitting the left-wing Popular Front against the National Conservative CEDA. When the votes were counted, the Popular Front had won a majority in Parliament, but everybody knew that a civil war was inevitable. The government ousted the current president, Zamora, as the Popular Front felt as if he was oblivious to the fact a civil war was about to occur, and was replaced with Manuel Lozana, a more left-wing figure. In order to have an advantage, the CNT infiltrated the National Police Force to have intelligence on when a coup would take place, as they did not trust the government would be able to properly fend off a fascist uprising. This was partially due to the years prior being riddled with union busting in miners' revolts across the country. The government had disarmed the workers, and now knowing that they needed to arm the workers to defend the Republic, they had to reverse course. With the CNT aware of a military plot taking place, they drew up plans to arm the workers and seize armories in order to create their own militia against the fascists. The CNT partnered with the FAI, an organization which had split from the CNT to create a more radical anarchist organization, but the two organizations believed the upcoming civil war required them to work together in order to defeat the fascists. When the war broke out in July of 1936, the CNT-FAI infiltrated armories all around Catalonia, mostly in the city of Barcelona. In addition to that, they seized post offices and telegraph offices, allowing them to take control of the city. The Parliament of Catalonia caved to the anarchists and allowed them to go on with economic collectivization. When the anarchists took control, everything was turned into a worker co-op, such as factories, restaurants, and even barbershops. The co-ops were run by workers' councils, in which workers of a workplace ran the business and each had the same amount of power. The workers' councils would collectively decide how many hours each person would work and how much pay each worker would receive. The CNT-FAI would eventually join the Republican government, despite being opposed to a centralized state. But the CNT-FAI accepted, as they knew that support from the government would allow their movement to survive. The government also did this due to fears the popularity of the anarchists would lead to the government being overthrown. The anarchists would receive major positions, such as the Minister of Justice now being run by anarchist Juan Garcia Olivier. Soon the anarchists turned their attention to the rural areas of the country in order to collectivize the farmland. The anarchists declared an end to all private property, and that land would be commonly owned by the people that worked on it. During this time period, around 2/3 of all land in Spain was run via workers' councils. However, one of the main opponents of the anarchist society which the CNT had created was the Soviet Union. The main supplier of weapons to the Republican government during this time was the Soviet Union, which caused them to have a large influence over the policies of the government. The Soviet Union ordered the Republican government to remove the anarchists, which the Republicans instantly did. This would lead to infighting amongst the Popular Front between the anarchists and the more moderate pro-government faction. But in 1939, all of the workers' councils were abolished by the victorious fascists of the Civil War, and the CNT-FAI would be outlawed, causing many of its members to flee to France. Today there are very few remaining anarchist organizations, but one which has had a relatively large success is the Zapatista National Liberation Army. The Zapatistas created their political organization sometime in the early 1980s in Mexico, with a small number of members. However, it wasn't until the 90s when they started to attract a large number of followers. The movement was created as a protest group to protest against the neoliberal policies that were being implemented at the time by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, primarily the NAFTA trade deal. The group was an advocate for indigenous rights and advocated for the Mexican indigenous people to rebel against the government. The Zapatistas were also angry at the country's privatization of communal farms run by indigenous Mexicans, known as ejidos. On the first day of 1994, the Zapatistas rebelled in the Mexican state of Chiapas and seized several towns. The day of rebellion also marked the day in which NAFTA was supposed to go into effect. The Zapatistas battled with Mexican troops for days and eventually retreated into the forest. However, rebellion would continue in Chiapas and spread to other Mexican states. Chiapas soon would have many Zapatista-controlled municipalities declaring themselves independent from the Mexican government. The president at the time, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, attempted to hold peace talks but was unsuccessful. The next president attempted to solve the problem by initiating an arrest warrant against the leader of the movement, known only as Subcommander Marcos. However, massive public backlash forced the president to initiate peace talks with the Zapatistas again, but the deal the Zapatistas came up with, the president refused to sign. The Zapatistas turned to organizing the villages they controlled into communes, as the government had pretty much given up on suppressing them. They created local governments called carcoles, which literally translates to snail shells. Land was redistributed to the indigenous population, and local municipalities were developed, which acted as workers' councils. The Zapatistas even built local schools in rural areas to educate indigenous children, as previously schools in Chiapas were underfunded. The Zapatistas also built medical centers, as well as a collectivized transportation system. The Zapatista militias acted as the army for the communes, and to this day guards around 60,000 families from the Mexican government's tyranny. In the year 2000, Vicente Fox became president of Mexico and restarted talks with the Zapatistas. They still could not come to an agreement. Today, nearly the entire Mexican state of Chiapas is controlled by the Zapatistas, with many others attempting to create communes in other parts of the country, but with little success. The Mexican government no longer engages with the Zapatistas, and the communes are virtually independent, but are not recognized by any member of the UN. The other major anarchist organized territory in the modern world is that of Rojava, a small territory in northeastern Syria. For centuries, a group of people known as the Kurds have inhabited the Middle East in Turkey, Syria, and Iran. The Kurds have long sought to create their own state, stretching from eastern Turkey to western Iran. However, they have never been able to do so until today. The founding of Rojava started in 2011 due to the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. During this time, the Arab Spring was occurring, a time in which mass protests against Middle Eastern governments was on the rise. One of these governments which people were protesting was the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Mass protests led to massive crackdowns by the government and suppression of freedom of speech. This led to rebellion against the Syrian government, organized by army defectors and political dissidents. The group of people became known as the Syrian Free Army. The outbreak of the civil war sparked many nations to support the side that best aligned with their interests. For instance, the US and many of its allies backed the Free Syrian Army. With the knowledge that the US was going to interfere with the war, Assad released jihadist prisoners to go join the Free Syrian Army to prevent the US from supplying the FSA, as they now had extremists in their ranks. This led to al-Qaeda becoming involved, with them aligning with the jihadists in the Free Syrian Army. During this time, Assad was being attacked by the rebels from multiple fronts and caused him to pull troops from the northern Kurdish region of Syria to fight the FSA in the southern regions. With the troops out of northern Syria, a left-wing political group called the Democratic Union Party seized the opportunity. This political party followed the teachings of Murray Bookchin, as well as Abdullah Öcalan, the founder of the PKK, a communist organization designated as a terrorist group in Turkey. The party advocated for libertarian socialism in a similar way the CNT-FAI did, in the sense that they supported the creation of localized communes run by workers' councils. The DUP claimed that the region was independent from Syria and formed their own militia to defend it. In addition to defense, Rojava, as it was now called, formed farming collectives and said that the collectivization of one's land was voluntary, yet nearly every landowner voluntarily made their farms into worker co-ops. Workers' councils were also a major part of Rojavan society, as decisions in the commune are made via direct democracy. Everybody in a commune comes to a meeting house and everyone makes decisions to improve life in the commune. A core tenet of Rojava is equality. Rojava's constitution states that men and women are equal, and women also have their own militia group called the Women's Protection Units, in order for the military not to become patriarchal. This merged with the already existing People's Protection Unions to form the Syrian Democratic Forces. However, Rojava faces multiple problems. Despite being extremely left-wing, the US government supported and supplied Rojava due to them being the only effective fighting force against ISIS. The Kurds also face large opposition from Turkey, as Turkey is worried about its links with the PKK, which is labeled as a terrorist group. In addition to this, Turkey also fears Kurdish nationalist sentiment in their own country, as Turkey has the largest population of Kurds in the world. Turkey has also bombed Rojava multiple times, angering the US and many others due to their reluctance to fight ISIS. Today, Rojava stands as one of the only anarchist territories to ever be formed. Despite it being faced with terrorist groups and the Turkish army, it still continues to be one of the only examples of an anarchist society. These societies show us that anarchism is not an unrealistic ideology to enact in society, and that countless examples show us that anarchist societies have been able to sustain themselves. It is true that many anarchist societies have fallen, but this is not because anarchism has failed, but rather the opposition to anarchist ideology by outside forces causes them to fall. This is especially the case for the Soviet Union, who destroyed 3 major anarchist societies. In addition to this, the Russian Revolution allowed the Marxists to become the main perpetrators of the communist movement, and the anarchists were left into obscurity. This would lead left-wing movements aligning with Marxism more as compared to anarchism. But what about the remaining anarchist movements that still exist today? Will they succumb to the same fate of the previous anarchist societies? With the fall of the Soviet Union, Marxism is no longer the dominant sub-ideology for leftists, and anarchist movements such as the Zapatistas and Rojava have proven that anarchy is making a small re-emergence into global affairs. With the onset of mass wealth inequality and an increasingly centralized government, it seems that the world is in a perfect spot for an anarchist revolution. But will an anarchist revolution ever occur? Only time will tell.